So friends, welcome to this webinar, the fourth in our series that is being organized by the Bahá'í Chair for Studies in Development. Over the past 3 months, the Bahá'í Chair for Studies in Development has organized a series of webinars bringing together social scientists and development practitioners to focus attention on the impact of the COVID pandemic on some of the most vulnerable sections of the population. What has become clear from these discussions is that attempts to bring about greater social and economic justice will remain superficial unless they are simultaneously accompanied with efforts to rethink prevalent development models and to make them more responsive to the needs and aspirations of the masses. Over the past many decades, economic policies in India have broadly focused on increasing aggregate economic growth with the assumption that much of the benefits of growth would somehow trickle down to all classes, communities, and regions, including the weakest sections of society. Backing up this development strategy with certain distributional initiatives was considered adequate to ensure equity and social justice. As a result of these policies, the rich have grown much richer, while there has been very little improvement in the wages and living conditions of the masses of the people living in poverty. Today, India faces a situation where an economy that was already in recession has been dealt a crippling blow by the COVID pandemic, with an estimated 122 million people having lost their means of livelihood. In this scenario, boosting economic growth will no doubt be indispensable to avoid large-scale misery and unemployment. However, the real challenge before policymakers is to ensure that in reviving the economy, considerations of equity and the need to target developmental needs of the underprivileged remains paramount. Inequality born of non-inclusive growth is, of course, not only the consequence of distributional blind spots in economic policy. Free market policies have opened the door for the rich to further enrich themselves through rent seeking, through lobbying for policies that allow them to extract more value created by others, and through profiting from assets such as natural resources that would ideally be public property. In addition to this, the era of hyper-globalization in the 90s and 2000s, with the dismantling of trade barriers, the container revolution, and the technological advances of the ICT revolution created vast opportunities for wealth generation, which the rich disproportionately benefited from. Extreme inequality as it exists in India today should be a matter of serious policy concern, since even a fraction of the enormous wealth possessed by the top 1% of the population that could be legitimately taxed and spent by the state could result in dramatic improvements to the health, education, and living conditions of millions of people living in dire want. A related criticism of such disparity is that it places enormous power in the hands of the rich to influence policies, public opinion, popular tastes, and the processes of knowledge generation. The persistence of economic inequalities has been shown to fuel widespread resentment and disenchantment with the status quo, which in turn creates an appetite for a politics that is based on bigotry and populism. Studies have pointed out how widening inequality erodes public trust, breaks down the social consensus needed to address collective challenges, and undermines institutions of governance. Eventually, a climate of social and political tension created by growing inequality makes sustaining economic growth itself a challenge. Addressing inequality will require, on the one hand, policies to limit the boundless and unregulated accumulation of wealth, and on the other hand, those interventions that enhance the capabilities of the underprivileged by focusing on their education, health, social security, and their access to infrastructure. Implementing such fundamental changes will require the abandonment of the temptation towards short-termism in policy making and replacing it with a long-term vision of development that is spiritually and ecologically sound and that will unfold through a process of systematic learning. A long-term vision of development that is sustainable, inclusive, and equitable will have to be guided by those eternal principles that determine harmonious collective existence, and not by mere pragmatic considerations. Justice and the oneness of humankind are the foremost among these principles. Justice is a prerequisite for a society to come together as one, and oneness based on the principle of unity in diversity is a prerequisite for fostering the consensus and collective will needed to deal with the great collective challenges before all societies in the 21st century, such as climate change, terrorism, and food and water security. Our common well-being will require the collective willingness to make difficult decisions and even sacrifices. This requires, before all things, trust among members of a society as equal stakeholders in the well-being of the whole. It also requires trust in the institutions that provide leadership to society as it navigates the collective towards a better future for the whole. The present webinar on the theme Pursuing Economic Justice, Prospects and Challenges in a Post-COVID World aims to explore the necessity and implications of reorienting economic policies to promote more equitable and inclusive growth so that economic progress is guided by spiritual principles and it translates into human development and social progress. Friends, with these initial comments, I would like to turn over the floor to our distinguished panel of speakers. But before that, I would like to request our panelists to place themselves on mute, those who are not, except of course for the ones who will be speaking. And also to our participants, I would like to mention that please post your questions for the panelists or your comments through the Q&A box, which you will see, which is the means through which your questions for the panelists will be taken. Our first speaker of the webinar is Professor Holly Hansen, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Mount Holyoke College in the US. She's of course retired now, and at present she serves as the coordinator of the research department at the Bahá'í World Center in Haifa, Israel. I'd like to welcome Holly to share her comments.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Dr. Fazli for arranging this series. The whole series has been such a balm to my being as the pandemic unfolded and as we could see the consequences, just to be listening to people engaging with it and trying to think, how can we use this moment and think about the long-term changes that it shows we need. I'm really grateful to have been able to learn from the other participants. And I hope that what I have to say now can be useful. What I would like to do is to put these questions of what we do into a historical context. And what I want to ask is, what is the useful time frame for thinking about the problem that we see of rural-urban migration and the tremendous suffering that was revealed during the pandemic? I think, I'm a historian, so I think that part of solving social problems is paying attention to how we understand their origin. If we place ourselves in time and we think, here is where we are, here is where we want to go, but the choices that other human beings made brought us to this point, that helps us, it helps us create a plan of action. Because where we are is the consequence of choices other human beings have made. And if we think about social structures, like if we think about the structural dimensions of millions and millions of people being unemployed at this moment, those structures weren't just deposited on the continent. They were the consequence of human choices. So millions and millions of individual human actions created the structures, and millions and gazillions of human actions hold those structures in place. But if we go back and we think about, when did they get created? How were they created? Whose choices created them? What are the consequences of those choices? That opens up the path of how they can be changed. So one of the ways that people can look at the present moment and see an origin for it is the observation that inequality really began to grow very seriously in the 1980s, which it absolutely did. But if we choose that point where the wealth of the 1% really diverges from everyone else's wealth, the consequence of if we choose that point, then the solution to that is redistribution, because it's redistribution choices that cause that divergence. So those are really useful, as Dr. Fosley said. But if we choose that as our beginning point, the only action that opens up is, how can people influence the people who are making the redistribution decisions? And it doesn't actually change the structural elements. The voicelessness, the lack of capacity, the lack of agency, the lack of material means, which are manifested in millions and millions of people suddenly being out of work and having nothing that they can do about it. Redistribution doesn't actually change those structures. The structures are the same, and maybe the people at the bottom will suffer a little bit less. So if we want to choose a point in time from which to orient our actions into the future, another point that we might choose is 150, 170 years ago with the Industrial Revolution, because that is a point when we can really see inequality taking off. And there are ways that this is graphed where you see, you know, like the economist Angus Maddison has done sort of large scale ways of looking at this. And you see national wealth kind of goes along in a kind of straight line from 1400, maybe it's going up a little bit. And then in the middle of the 19th century, there's these very steep increases in national GDP. And another graph that looks a lot like that is the use of energy. So at the same time that GDP start to increase, energy use goes up, and also a graph of patents, of invention, follows a really similar line. And this is a point in time that we can look at, and we can see in it a real acceleration of wealth, and along with that, a real acceleration of inequality. Because industrial technology created fantastic wealth. It also created the concentration of economic activity in urban areas that relates directly to the crisis that we're seeing right now. And it's also a moment in time where there's a loss of agency, a loss of voice, a de-skilling of many people who are productive agents, lose the patterns of economic productivity, require less skill of many of the productive actors. And there's this tremendous immiseration. So we could absolutely choose the process of industrialization as the point that is the beginning of the difficulties we're looking at and the problems we need to solve. But I think there's a reason to ask ourselves whether we really want to choose that as the origin point, because there's a danger of an association in our minds, which is industrialization created inequality, and therefore inequality is inherent in the technology. So we kind of have this terrible choice. If we want a world with hot running water and airplanes and an abundance of material goods for some, not for everyone, and universal elementary education, if we want all of these things that we have created with the abundance of wealth that industrialization gave us, then we just have to accept the inequality too, because the inequality emerges out of the technology. And the way that people can talk about this is path dependence. Like, maybe we could have taken a different path, maybe we could have done it a different way, but we did it this way. And therefore we're on a path and we're stuck with it. Like, we built a prison, it's pretty comfortable for some people, but now we have to live in that prison. And this is a habit of mind that I think we really, really want to challenge and question. Because if it's true, if inequality is inherent in the technology that we rely on, then all we can do is ameliorate it. All we can do is make things better for people on the edges. You know, we can find ways for communities of people at the really bottom to suffer less than they do. Maybe give them a little bit of agency on the edge, but the structures are still going to the structures are still going to be engines of massive inequality. I believe more. I think I would like to assign more capacity to us as human beings in the present. If it was lots and lots and lots and millions of human choices that created that system, why isn't it possible for us to very deliberately and in an organized way make millions and gazillions of economic choices that open up something else. So if that's possible, then we need to look back further. We need to ask ourselves, what were people thinking? What was the context when we industrialized in the way that we did? How could we have done it differently? How could we make ourselves path independent from this path on which we seem to be dependent? And I think this is a really important question, because as a historian, when I look at the middle of the 19th century, I see human beings making a lot of really bad decisions. For example, what was the model for the factory? The industrial factory was based on the largest scale, the largest use of human labor in a really organized form to produce something quickly, which was the sugar plantation. So we based industrial labor on the labor of enslaved people on a sugar plantation, which maybe wasn't the right way to do it. So I'd like to take us back another step and think of another moment in time as a place from which we could frame our thinking about how do we create economic justice. And that would be 200 years earlier, like maybe 1600, with the formation of the British East India Company. Because what we see in this point, which is absolutely before industrialization, but there's a moment, in the beginning of the 17th century, when forms of economic activity really change, like the structures of that economic activity change. It's a long time ago. And I'm not saying we should go back and recreate the world of the 17th century because it was better. What I'm saying is, if we look on the other side of industrialization, we can see forms of organizing productive activity, which may give us some inspiration for what we want to do in the future. So let me give you one example. Back before the British East India Company, and before the kind of what some people would call war capitalism and other people call mercantilism, there were forms of economic organization which were not designed to concentrate wealth in one place. So if you compare the joint stock limited liability company, which has the purpose of gathering huge amounts of wealth in order to make a profit fighting a war, and so a joint stock company masses tremendous amounts of wealth and limits it and makes the people who hold it not responsible for the actions of the company. If you compare that with 𝐏𝐽𝐫, so 𝐏𝐽𝐫 is a partnership between one person who has labor and one person who has capital, and they write a contract together, and they produce wealth, and then when they divide it, they're partners, and it divides between the two of them. Those are both forms of economic organization, but one has the consequence of undermining inequality, and the other has a consequence of building it. All right, I have to speed up. So if we go back and place the origin of our present structural problems, not in the 1980s when inequality is growing, and not in the 19th century when India and other nations were industrializing, but 200 years before that, and if we shift and we notice the shift in ways of organizing economic activity, then it opens up the space for thinking about things differently. Because what we can see in that moment is a tremendous growth in scale, a loss of complexity, a loss of agency, a loss of communities having economic agency. Carl Polanyi talks about this. He says, the smashing up of social structures to extract the labor inside of them. So I'm not saying we should go back to the 18th century, the 17th century. What I'm saying is we have to look at the choices human beings made. And then we have to look at the way we have rationalized some really bad choices. And we have to ask ourselves, are the structures that we have now, are they inevitable? Or are they a consequence of our imagining that the rationalization we made of really bad choices is true and the choices we made were the only choices? If in the present, we were to stand in the present and say, look to the future and say, 50 years from now, or 100 years from now, or 150 years from now, we want to have undone the consequences of really bad decisions. What kinds of things would we need to do? We would need to create spaces for cultivating a collective vision. We would have to pay attention to how do we generate knowledge, not just among elites, but how do we shift our habits of generating knowledge so knowledge generation is happening everywhere. We would have to think, how do we remember what we've forgotten, what has been systematically, relentlessly devalued, of how to hold on to collective aspirations, how to be united, how to be motivated by generosity. So could we have a different modernity? Could we have a modernity where everybody has hot running water and everybody and universal elementary school education and the internet and an abundance of material things and agency and voice and a sense of collective effort? I think we could. And what makes that possible is our recognizing that we could do it and that the present we have isn't inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly, for, in a sense, giving us this historical context in which to view this question of economic justice. I think not just communities and individuals, even governments, I think people would agree, have more or less adopted a fatalistic approach to this question of inequality and, what are the possibilities of really making fundamental structural changes. So it's actually refreshing to take this long historical view of what options, what choices brought us to this particular historical position that we are at this period in time. And to remember that there were choices, that there were different options, and the elite that made those choices could have made different choices. And so hence, again, maybe historically, to bring that, to see how that is relevant for us, then maybe it reminds us that this, in a sense, the first principle might be to remember that it's not a given. Inequality can be addressed. But then, as you said, it will require, one can't take a romantic or a simplistic view of, and that's why we have the economists in our midst who are going to help us think of the complexity of that challenge. Our next speaker is Professor Amitabh Kundu, whom we all know very well. He is at present a distinguished fellow at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries in New Delhi, and he has been a distinguished academic and written many books and papers, which we have had the privilege of reading. So we will listen to Professor Kundu. I will just put on his PowerPoint. I just wanted to mention also that our in case our participants are wondering about our fifth speaker, Professor Subramanian, he mentioned this morning that there is a prolonged power outage in Chennai, and so he will not be able to sign in, but he has sent a video recording of his talk, which we will play at the end of the, I mean, as the last contribution to this discussion. So over to you, Professor Kundu. I'll just put the screen on. Professor Kundu, we can't hear you. I don't know if you're, we cannot hear. There's no audio.
So Kundu, the audio was working well earlier. So I don't know if you've added some other device. If you just remove that, I think it should work.
I think.
Hello, is it all right?
Yes, now it's fine. Perfect.
Oh, Holly is also engrossed in listening to her, and her voice was coming mute. So I just plugged in something else, and that made me silent. Thank you. Good morning to the panelists and the other participants. It's a privilege to be part of this distinguished panel. And I must tell you that Holly Hansen's presentation gives us a lot of material for us to do some introspection. The French-born American, microbiologist, René Dubois. Can we go to the first slide, please? He was a social visionary and also a humanist. He made a very important point. He says that every civilization creates its own diseases. And after going through the long experience world over of lockdown and in India, and also looking at the concept note and listening to the wonderful presentation of Holly, I'm convinced that the disease that our civilization has produced is not the pandemic, COVID-19, but inequality. And I'm very happy that the concept note prepared by Arash draws our attention to the social and economic structures which have created inequality. All that the pandemic did was to bring out this inequality into public domain. It did not make people poor and vulnerable by itself, but more importantly, it simply brought their poverty, misery, and vulnerability into public domain. And I'm really very happy that Holly talked about the choices that were made at some point in history. And perhaps this is one opportunity where we can do some introspection about whether those choices which led to a peculiar labor-capital relationship labor management relationship, whether they have been responsible for the sharp inequalities, growing inequalities, which really brings the manifestation in a very, very, alarming manner which the humanity is suffering. Guterres, the General Secretary of UN, has also mentioned that this pandemic has only successfully drawn our attention to the serious problems of inequality. And at a recent document prepared by World Economic Forum, Amitabh Bihar I think you made a presentation last year in that. You mentioned that the sharp inequality that exists in the social field, in the economic field, your access to air, water, education, health, all that determines the status of your well-being, your health, and your vulnerability to the pandemic. So it is really the structural inequality that this concept note is asking us to look at it, that what are the factors and how this can be perhaps addressed. And what I would do quickly, and Arash, you give me a warning before 1 minute, is to look at some of the changes that have been brought in India in terms of labor capital relationship, labor management relationship. We know that 3 codes of labor have been passed recently. It's a massive survey is being conducted, with whom I'm partly associated, on collecting information on the vulnerable workers, on the migrant workers, on domestic workers, transport workers, whether this is really taking us to a more equal development process, or would it really maintain? I will just briefly comment, although the empirical data with me is not adequate, but certainly we can speculate on that. Let's look at the global inequality. Arash, next one, please. You see, this is a table which I have prepared on the basis of the Human Development Report prepared by UNDP. At 2 points of time, you are aware that UNDP has started giving inequality adjusted Human Development Index. Basically, it also brings out the inequality. If a country has a high level of human development but has sharp inequality, the level goes down. So what I did is to put the countries into 3 categories. You can call it high, medium, low. I call it very high, high, and medium and low combined. And what we find that income inequality, if you shift this graph a little bit, you'll see in very highly developed countries is pretty high, but inequality in health and education is not very high. It is just 5%, 6%, 7%. But you go to the next category and you do find that income inequality remains high, but the inequality in health and education increases. But come to the lowest category, which has 93 countries in 2011, and I updated it for 2018, and you do find that much more than the income inequality, the health inequality and educational inequality becomes far more important. And the same thing is true for the Asian countries. In the Chinese context, you do find that health inequality, which is basically measured in terms of life expectancy, that is inequality that exists within China, that is not very high. One can say that perhaps it's because of the communist regime, or it could be, the data issues are also there always with the Chinese system. But Indian context, life expectancy inequality, that means how long you are going to live. And that depends on which income bracket, which region you belong to, which gender you belong to. That is something which is very, very alarming. Please go to the next one. I'll quickly go over the next few slides. You see, the red one shows the income inequality, blue one shows the educational inequality, and the green one shows the health inequality. This is for the developed countries for 2011. I did it for different points of time. I'm giving the latest. You do find income inequality is very high for the very highly developed countries. The health inequalities are much lower, and educational inequality is also not as high. In India, the educational inequality, where my child goes and where my domestic help children go, is very, very important. Whereas that kind of an inequality in access to education does not exist on an average in the developed countries, despite all the ills of capitalism that we have heard. Go to the next one, please. This is for the middle level countries. Yes, the next one. Yeah, you find that income inequalities are there, but educational inequalities are coming up and health inequalities are also coming up, which means as we move for the most developed countries to the next country, category, you find educational inequality and health inequality become prominent, as important as income inequality. And come to the third category, which is the lowest category, you find that, yes, next one, please. You see, no, sorry. Please go to the earlier one. So this is inequality adjustment for the lower categories. So basically, the one we have skipped at the middle level, you do find, this is for the middle level, you find that educational inequalities are coming up, health inequalities are also coming up. And third category, you now go to the next one, you find that educational inequality for many countries is much higher, and the same is true for India. Health and educational inequality is much sharper than the income inequality, which we know in India is pretty high. Go to the next one. You know, the gender dimension is extremely important. As far as health of the household is concerned, there are many studies which show it is the woman's educational status, woman's status within the family, her health consciousness determines the overall health of the household, including that of the so-called head of the household. You find in the Indian context, it is alarming. Even slightly, the gender development index is pretty low compared to Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh. India is slightly better, if that's a matter of satisfaction, than Pakistan as far as gender development is concerned. And that is directly related with the health issues. Please go to the next one. So I just wanted to see quickly, since I don't have much time, I just wanted to see the present reforms in the labor capital relationship, which has been ushered in many of the states. And they're saying it is because of the poor people's engagement, because we have to unlock, because the number of deaths because of hunger is equal to the number of deaths due to pandemic. So there seems to be a scenario being created that this opening up is being pushed for the benefit of the poor. I would like to see whether really we are moving in the right direction. Are we ensuring greater economic equality by the reforms and the present measures? This is the graph. This is going back a little. This is the graph presented for income inequality, health inequality, and educational inequality. And you do find that in the Indian context, health inequalities are much sharper, educational inequalities are much sharper as compared to the income inequality. There is no prize for guessing which state has the lowest inequality. That is, Kerala has the lowest inequality both in education and health. But we find that both the developed states as well as less developed states have very high inequality in health and education. Please go to the next one. Now this you can skip. This is a statistical analysis which I will present somewhere else. But basically the point I was making, that economy is in a shamble during the period of the pandemic, but the trend was visible even earlier. Much before the pandemic hit us, our economy was going downhill, as we can see from the GDP growth rate. Next one, please. And you find, the right-hand side, I don't know, is not visible for me. It shows a sharp decline of minus 23.9% in the last quarter, which is really a manifestation of the inequality which existed. And indeed, it is true that the poorest section have been hit, poverty level has gone up, but the middle class and upper classes comfort level has certainly been tremendously affected. Think about it. Yes, it is indeed true that the poverty among the unorganized workers have gone up, but the pangs and troubles, mental, psychological, and physical, of the upper class, not to have their luxury of traveling around, have a luxurious life, and being confined to the internet and Netflix and domestic confines, is certainly painful. Although the case is being made that economic reforms in the labor market and capital market is for economic justice, I would certainly like to look at it a little more rigorously in terms of empirical data. Please go to the next one. I just reviewed the labor laws which have been amended across different states. Uttar Pradesh is one state where maximum concession has been made in terms of the labor laws, because what has been identified is the labor laws which are coming in the way of mass investment coming in the small and medium scale industries. So there has been in the Uttar Pradesh all the labor laws excepting the Factories Act and the Industrial Disputes Act. All other laws have been suspended for 1,000 days. In Madhya Pradesh, even the Industrial Disputes Act have been suspended for about 3 months, and many other legislations which have been won with a long drawn struggle by the laboring class have been really weakened over time. Please go to the next one. I don't want to go into the details because a paper is coming where I have analyzed the changes in the labor laws. You find Gujarat has exempted all the registered factories from the provisions of the number of hours of work, daily hours, and the compensation to be paid that have been allowed. Rajasthan has done the similar kind of a thing, that you can really increase the number of hours to 12 hours without paying an extra per hourly basis. You can pay the same hourly rate, which was not allowed if you want to extend the hours of work. Himachal Pradesh tells this similar story. The understanding is that if you relax the labor laws, automatically labor intensive growth takes place. The experience of Gujarat and Rajasthan over the past 12 years shows that this did not happen. Relaxation of labor laws does not necessarily bring in greater investment. In case of Rajasthan, in case of Gujarat, yes, investment did come in, but labor intensive industries did not come up. Please go to the next one. Now, there is an apprehension that these labor protections which have been given by legislative and administrative system in India could be diluted. I am happy that Supreme Court bench Krishna Kumar Singh versus State of Bihar has recognized the power of the states to make such ordinances in extraordinary situations. But the Supreme Court has clearly stated that these ordinances and the amendments which are taking place are subject to judicial scrutiny. And I strongly would like to advocate, if I have some association with the government agencies, to say all these ordinances and the relaxation must be reviewed within the next 3 months period. Please go to the next one. Now, you see, one argument which is being given that labor market should be united, people should be able to move freely, and that's why the sharp inequality that exists in unemployment rate, north-south divide is very much there, because the south has achieved, more or less stable population. Total fertility rate is around 2.1, so that means overall growth rate will be not high. But northern states are growing at a faster rate. There has to be labor mobility. There has to be migration. You cannot have perfectly equal distribution immediately, but you do find that the southern states, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, in the last 3 months have brought in ordinances and laws to ensure that the jobs are reserved, at least at the lowest level, even in the private sector, for the locals. So labor market integration is being questioned by that. Constitution has allowed equal, right to movement, which is also being questioned by states like Maharashtra and Gujarat when they are trying to reserve jobs requiring local languages proficiency as a requirement. Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal, you do find there are noises being made. And I think all these provisions which are really fragmenting the labor law and in a way restricting the access of the laborers to the maximum remuneration, and that is ensured by the Article 16 of the Constitution, but that is being questioned. I go to the last few slides before I conclude.
Just 1 minute if you can conclude.
Okay, Arash, just one. Now, there are 3 labor laws, labor codes which have been passed. The workers' unions say that, well, some of them are desirable, some of them are really empowering, and I myself looked at these codes. The codes relate to workers' safety at the workplace, workers' access to social security measures for the family, and third is workers-employer relationship. Many of them are actually resulting in empowerment of the workers, but there are many other provisions which really weaken the strength of the workers' unions. Individual empowerment of workers, they say, yes, that is very important because the unorganized sector doesn't have access to trade unions, but the capacity of the trade union has certainly been weakened by many of the provisions in the codes. I do not want to go into the details. There are requirements that if any union has to take the responsibility for the whole labor, 75% of the workers should be members. That's a very strong requirement. There are exemptions made under Chapter 5 for the registered industries. The limit has been taken to 3 crore, which is certainly a big exemption, which really means many of the industries will be out of the labor laws. I just don't want to go into the details, but certainly you do find that the quote unquote revolutionary measures, which are for the empowerment of the working class, to a certain extent, they have helped strengthen the hands of the unorganized workers, but the trade unions' capacity has been reduced. Please go to the next one. Now, as I just mentioned it, that labor codes mentioned that 500 million workers, both in the organized and unorganized sector, has been given the security provisions, PFO benefits, social security funds. But many of the clauses said this would apply to factories which have 10 plus workers, 20 plus workers, 300 plus workers, which really means there are categorization. So you go into the detail and you do find that in many cases, exemptions given to the employers are very, very significant, which may really weaken their position, and the long gains, the gains that the laboring class in India has acquired with a long struggle may get diluted. Go to the last slide, please. Well, this is Gujarat, Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh. There are experimental models, and which really showed, I mentioned it, that relaxation in the labor laws do not necessarily bring in more investment, and even if it does not bring investment in labor promoting, labor intensive industries. The final slide, since Holly talked about the historical things, I thought I will just emphasize that point. The next one, please. The next slide. Yeah, I mean, there are some happy indications. There are green shoots. GST has picked up. Regular employment, which was falling, it was stalled in September. October, again, there is showing a disturbing trend. But I was comparing the figures of unemployment in September, October this year and September, October last year. I don't think there is a major increase because unemployment rate was very high even before the pandemic came. That's the point I'm making, that pandemic simply brought it out, and the present concern for the unorganized worker doesn't get reflected in the policy reforms. You do find that overall impact will be to promote growth. And I am convinced there are social development indicators. I must say the lifestyle of the middle class and the upper class has been hit hard, and they're just, imagine a lot of money is there, but you don't know how to spend it. All the spending avenues have gone. And I think the present concern of promoting economic growth is very much linked to the interest of the upper and the middle class. Last one, please. I'm just waiting for that. I just wanted to bring you this story from the 14th century Europe, where the big bubonic plague struck Europe, and in many countries they lost 30% of their population. So much larger number of deaths which occurred, and this spectacular failure resulted in passing of the statutes. The statutes of labor in England was passed in 1351 after the pandemic hit in 1348, and the Ordinance of Laborer came in 1349. The Statute of Laborers came, which really did the same thing to an extent which is being done now. It was done much more stringently, much more rigorously, that wages will be fixed. It will be around the survival rate, and laborers are not allowed to move from one place to another so that the industrialists can have easy access to the labor market. Now that resulted in the biggest revolution, peasant revolution in 1381, which with a huge human cost and property cost. I'm simply saying that we should learn from history so that we don't repeat it, we're able to transcend it. And my submission, therefore, is, since I'm to some extent associated with the survey which is being conducted at the all India level for the unorganized workers, ensuring them justice, ensuring that the migrants return to a city which is more accommodative, more human, and less exploitative, we should move into that direction. We should re-examine the changes in the acts and the ordinances so that we do not get into the same kind of a mistake that the world experienced, Europe experienced in the 14th century. We should look at the changes in the ordinances which are taking place in different states in the name of promoting growth, in the name of protecting the lives of the poorer sections. We have to re-examine them because there are many implications of these changes which we are not able to consider right now, because our present concern is just to push up the growth. I would certainly think that the government has taken certain measures which are hopeful, which are giving some hopeful signs, but a serious re-examination of these ordinances and the changes in the acts is required if we really want to move to the direction of economic justice. I agree with Holly Hansen, although she mentioned that redistribution is important, but basically what she was saying, there are structural shifts. Once you have generated income, if you just redistribute, this is is a very small measure. Your structure of the economy should be changed so much, that you don't need to do redistribution. Income generation process itself becomes more, equitable, and that is possible if we have the labor capital relation and labor management relation in perfect order. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kundu, for this very rich and nuanced discussion of the situation in India with inequality, and specifically focusing on the issue of labor relations and how the question of inequality can be, in a sense, viewed through the prism of this industry labor or capital labor relations in India. I'm sure we have. I see there are 3 questions already in the Q&A box. So we will discuss them after the next speaker's presentation. But in the meantime, if the speakers wish, those questions that are specifically directed at them, they can even respond to them in writing by replying to those questions. So our next speaker, without taking more time, I'd like to introduce Amitabh Bihar, who is, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Oxfam India, an institution that has a lot to say and has done a lot of work in regard to addressing economic inequalities. And he's also a global civil society leader and an authority on tackling economic and gender equality and building citizen participation. Over to you, Amitabh.
Thank you, and absolutely delighted to be here. And it's been a pleasure listening to you, Holly, and it's always a privilege to be with Professor Kundu, and for 25 years I've been following him, so it's great to again get an opportunity to speak after him. So, in terms of, let me just say that it was interesting, as in this panel seems interesting to me. All of you are academics. I am the only non-academic. So I assume the expectations from me are not that you would have from an academic. I'm a practitioner, I'm a civil society person, so I'll probably bring in that perspective. And just, thank you, Harsh. The paper that you shared and your initial comments were extremely helpful, very rich, and you have covered so much ground. There's only one point of divergence in your response to Holly's presentation. You somewhere said, let's not be romantic. That's how I heard that. But ultimately, if you have to change the world, it is a huge dose of realism, but romanticism is very, very integral to changing worlds. So that's going to be critical for us, and hopefully that will reflect in what I'm going to say. So we've all woken up, at least in India, to this absolutely bizarre situation where the sitting president of the oldest democracy actually says that I've won while the votes are being counted, and he says, let's stop any further counting. So it is really bizarre, and I'm bringing that in because I do think it reflects a serious disruption. So while COVID is a disruption, but it is symptomatic of a very, very serious disruption. And that is the disruption of the normative consensus that we've had over the last 100 years, certainly post Second World War. This is the first time that the normative consensus is now getting challenged and diminished. And that's happening across. It's just a symptom. You saw this in Trump today, but starting from Trump to Boris Johnson, to Turkey, to our Modi, to go to Philippines, it's the same story. And that's, I think, a fundamental disruption that we need to understand. And people like Professor Kundu, I would request them to actually, link it also with the growing inequality. There is a lot of work that we see, but I think it's critical to understand this rise of demagogues along with the rise of economic inequality. On the other hand, yes, COVID has been a phenomenal disruption. As in, we just heard from Professor Kundu, a negative growth rate of 23%. ILO study actually said early on in May that in India itself, we'll have almost 400 million people who might slide back to poverty. 400 million people. That's what the ILO study was saying. But I would say, the numbers, because I'm not a numbers person, the visuals that we saw of hunger, of the migrant labor, it was completely heartbreaking. My colleagues were working, we were providing just food, but the level of devastation that we saw, it was heart-wrenching. That one visual from NDTV, which doesn't go away from me, is where a person with a very hungry child was trying to collect milk, which was spilled over on the road, using a cloth to just, soak whatever milk he could get to collect it in a bowl and then give it to his child. And it's really, as in, we've not seen this level of disruption for a long time. And I must say, what was deeply saddening and tragic, I still think that the devastation that we saw was much more policy induced and less virus induced. That's the sad part, that a lot of this misery could have been avoided by thinking through our policy choices that we made, or at least by being responsive to the realities that we saw once the policy was implemented. It's bizarre that when you see those hundreds and thousands of people walking on the road, you still say that we cannot do anything, and what you give them is the police baton and not transportation back to their villages. Absolutely devastating, and that's the level of disruption that we've seen, and it's a global story in varying degrees. So this is an excellent time for us to start thinking about how do we reboot ourselves, and I think both Holly, Professor Kundu, and you also have already talked about, what are the contours of inequality, and it's really well said in these three presentations. I'm sure Parag will add to it, but let me just add one or two things which is there, but just to highlight. One, we've talked of economic inequality, but just to give it again a visual form. As Oxfam, we have always been using that. In India, 2 years ago, we had 9 people, and trust me, we are talking of just 9 people who can sit in one Innova, who had more wealth than 50% of the Indian population. So 9 people, more wealth than, say, 65 crore people of this country. That's the level of economic inequality. But let me just give you a few added bits of it to give the flavor. And as we've been discussing, this is not just about economic inequality. And I want to highlight that, and it came out very strongly from Holly's first presentation. Ultimately, it's about also structures. So let me just give you one example. 3-4 years ago, I was in Marathwada doing some work in the drought area. I was probably in Parbhani, and then I came back to Pune. I was driving, And in Pune, I got a call from Sainath. I'm sure most of us know Sainath, the journalist. And I told him that I'm going to go to Mumbai. And he said, oh, you're going to Mumbai. Please keep a lookout on the big hoardings that you will see on the highway. And I did. And it was fascinating, but again, heartbreaking. I was coming from a drought-prone area, or rather a drought-hit area, where there was tremendous misery because of the drought. And once I think I crossed Lonavala, what we saw were big hoardings saying that buy a flat with your individual swimming pool. And that's, and it kept coming back after every 5 kilometers. And visually, you could see that picture of that multi-storied building. Every flat had a swimming pool and asking us to buy those. Just imagine just coming straight from a drought area to these pictures. So it is, inequality obviously is at multiple levels. Just look at, my doctor friends tell me, and the literature tells us that at birth, the ratio of boys to girls, you do have almost 1,000 boys being born for 1,000 girls. That's what the doctors say. And by, biologically, probably girls are stronger. So the idea was probably for nature that it would become equal. But at this moment in India, we have for 0 to 6, a child sex ratio of only 916 girls per 1,000 boys. We're essentially talking of almost 84 missing girls per 1,000, which Amartya Sen talked of, the missing millions. So we're not letting them be born just because they're girls. So this is all about sex selective abortion. And we can go on, as in Professor Kundu's work on, say, the Muslim socioeconomic indicators, or as in for this group, to talk of Dalit or Adivasis, just in terms of an Adivasi woman's, their access to education versus general women is going to be almost 20 points difference. So those are the levels of inequality, and these social structures need to be centrally brought into our conversation of whatever we are doing. This year's Oxfam's inequality report talks of unpaid care work, and which will give you again, a very clear sense of the inequality, and in terms of time poverty women go through because of underpaid and unpaid care work. Okay, just moving ahead. So, I'm very happy that you did not frame this conversation as inclusive growth, which is the buzzword. And I'm glad that you're bringing in justice. And I do think that should really be the guiding conversation. And it's come through in Holi's presentation, Professor Kundu's presentation. I worked for a long time. And I was very involved with the MDGs and also the framing of the Sustainable Development Goals. And MDGs, we kept saying, were the minimum development goals, and we were critiquing it. And I was really quite involved with the framing of the SDGs. And in one of the constant demands that we had, but unfortunately we could not get that, was that you need to change the frame from tackling extreme poverty to looking at justice as the fundamental frame for Sustainable Development Goals. So while it made big giant leaps forward in terms of bringing climate, economic, and social together, but it still has a frame of tackling poverty. It does not really start getting into questions of justice. So this framing, I think, would be extremely critical for all of us. So let me, just try and now look at how do we move ahead. Just 3 or 4 ideas, broad ideas of what needs to be done. And as I've said, all 3 of you have spoken before me. I pretty much agree with all that's been said. So let me just say, the first that I would say is that at least let's ensure what has been the accepted framework of rights and entitlements. And let's not get into this post, the neoliberal conversation in which even the basic fundamental rights like education, like health, sanitation are being converted into services and then being converted into commodities, which people need to buy. I think, once we start rebooting, can we at least resolve to ensure that the basic rights and entitlements for every citizen, for every person on planet Earth is ensured. I think that's critical. It can be done, and we've also seen now with Professor Kundu's presentation that how it also becomes a way of tackling economic inequality. So that's I think a fundamental, and on that, this idea of a state is going to be critical, and you cannot have a state which is just a regulator. It has to be a welfare state which ensures these fundamental rights for everyone. So that cannot be taken away. The second, again, about how do you ensure decent work for everyone, dignified livelihood for everyone. That's the second piece. That has to be the focus. And again, in terms of the labor laws reforms that we are seeing, it is actually taking away hard-fought labor rights, which people got over 2 centuries, 3 centuries, and that's being taken away now. As in, if you can't even associate, if you are made to work more than 8 hours, it is going to be totally unacceptable. So, that's the first, I would say, that these are, I thought, and collectively, many of us believe that these are givens. These are the fundamentals of any decent society, and we need to work with that. So that's the one, the first idea. And again, if you look at our work as Oxfam, we come up with an index called Commitment to Reducing Inequality, in which we are essentially looking at progressive taxation, investments in public services, and labor rights. So that's also a framework that we have done. The second, I think, which is critical for me, and for again for this conversation, I think, and with the climate crisis that we're looking at, with planetary boundaries not being respected, we certainly need to get out of this GDP obsession. It is something that's it is way beyond its expiry date now. If we have to think of a future post-COVID, and in any way, in any sensible way, if we are even trying to address the climate crisis, then we cannot have the GDP obsession or the market fundamentalism that we have. And we need to move to, and this is not, this is where I would say, maybe I'm being romantic, but I must also say it's not just my romanticism. You have an example in Bhutan, which is talking of happiness index. You have an example of New Zealand, which has actually done away with this, and they're now talking of a well-being index. So they're concrete examples, and we would need to make that shift. I think a lot of choices would start shifting if we start doing that.
Amitabh, if you can just conclude in a minute.
We'll do that. Okay, so I'll do that in a minute or 1.5 minutes. So the third that I would say in terms of the big idea moving ahead, which I feel very, very strongly about, is that this is a moment where our social contract is being disrupted. As in, at least for me, living in India, for me, the Constitution is a sacred document, and the fundamentals of that Constitution, of liberty, of equality, of fraternity, are being threatened. And this is the first time, I think, in independent India, it's now being said that needs to be changed, and that's unacceptable, and that's happening globally. So if we are not able to fight back, and again ensure that these fundamental pillars, fundamental organizing values of society are reestablished, I do think that we cannot reboot ourselves. Looking at economic choices, if the social strife that we see of Hindu Muslims in this country, if that continues, then it's not going to work in any way. So that's become very, very fundamental. Institutions are becoming weak. So the whole idea of democracy and reestablishing substantive democracy is critical, not a democracy where strong men subvert democracy and its principles by winning elections smartly. And finally, I think, let's recognize that I do feel inequality is not about an economic question. It is a moral question. It's obscene, it's outrageous. We cannot accept it. So in these times of crony capitalism, what I do believe is that it is about rebuilding democracy bottom up. And that's going to be very, very critical. I think, just making economic choices or even political choices, that's the learning that I have now over the last 8 to 10 years, that maybe party political battles are important, but how do you fight democratic battles starting from the self, from home, fighting patriarchy and building a democratic society? If you don't do this, it's unlikely that you will eventually move towards any kind of a just society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amitabh. It was very, again, a very interesting and thought-provoking perspective on the breakdown of the normative consensus and the need to once again rejuvenate those foundational links that keep sustain civilized life. So maybe we could just, take a few questions. One of the questions that Mona has posted is basically asking about this idea of development and why is it different in the developed and underdeveloped world. And I'd like to just, maybe take this question in a slightly broader perspective. And, just looking at a few ideas that the three speakers so far have shared. One question that comes up is of popular consciousness of inequality. There is a philosopher in Oxford, 𝐿, and he talks about, a lot of his philosophical work is on economic inequality, and he talks about how every day 16,000 children die of preventable diseases. In other words, there could have been something done to prevent that. And he says to understand what that means, he says, imagine there are 16 fully loaded Boeing 747s that crash every day. He says, imagine what kind of outrage that would create across the world, and how humanity would do everything possible. But the reason why probably a similar response is not evoked when it comes to these preventable deaths is probably part of it is because it's invisibilized. It's not, and a large section of society has become apathetic. So the question is, who is going to rise up to address this? I mean, one could put it to the policymakers, but that's also part of the problem, that it's not a popular effort. It's not part of popular consciousness. We are not even aware of the deep inequalities. I don't know if the speakers would like to take a stab at this question and share their thoughts.
Arash, may I come in?
Yes, Professor.
Arash, I mean, I have access to some data in Delhi, ward-wise, of the cases, number of cases and number of deaths. There is absolutely no statistical evidence to suggest that it is the poorer sections of the population who have been hit by this. I mean, and the sufferings are higher, slightly death rate may be higher, but certainly I think this pandemic has affected the rich and the poor more or less in an equal manner. And that's why, I mean, to say that there is not much of concern for pandemic because it's not the aeroplanes and the richer people only are dying, I don't think correct, because in Europe, there is a strong protest, in UK also, against the lockdown measures and saying that the number of deaths because of other morbidities, if you take that out, 60-70% of the deaths which are attributed to corona would have happened in any case. So I think let's not go into that debate. I mean, I personally believe that, with Amitabh, I had a long-standing discussion, and him and many other friends tell me that visuals are much more powerful than statistics. I was not convinced, but I was when I saw the visuals that Amitabh talked about on the TV, that one small child of 10 years, 12 years carrying a load, people picking up milk from the road. But I want to ask this question to him and the whole panel, that why do you think that thousands of migrants started walking hundreds of kilometers knowing that, this is a dangerous thing? Why do they pick up food from the street? They know it is dangerous. You think they are irrational people? No, they are not. I can give you an explanation. They're in any case working inhumanly for 9 hours. And they think it is very rational that if you walk for 12 hours, we'll reach home. So basically the point is, it is not irrational on their part to pick up food from the street because they're doing it every day. It's only the pandemic which brought it into public domain. Otherwise, the existence of these poor people is miserable. We simply noticed them when it came on the visual. I would like to tell you that out of the people who started walking, 99% reached their home. 1% didn't because of ailment or because of... In any case, 1% of the people would have died during the 9 months period because of various other things. So I would simply say that let us not blame the pandemic, that this has made the poor people miserable, vulnerable. They are vulnerable. Only we are noticing them. And they're, as I said, that they have walked hundreds of miles. Just basically, they thought that it is a rational decision. We work inhumanly for 9 hours. Let us work for 12 hours. We'll reach home. So I personally believe that the present concern of boosting up the economy and economic growth is not really linked with the poor people's concern. It's the concern of the middle class and the upper class whose lifestyle have been completely disrupted. The number of mental cases among the rich have gone up significantly. So let us not really try to say that economic growth is being pushed for the poor, miserable and vulnerable sections of the population. This is for the macroeconomic concern, and the concern for the poor and the laboring class is not perhaps in the forefront. That's my submission.
I would like to address this question, and also it relates to part of what Amitabh was saying, by thinking about how are we defining justice? So often we think of justice as in terms of distribution, but there are also ways of thinking about justice, and South Africa is a really good example, where we think of justice as reparative, as a way of creating interactions among people that restores social connection. And if we imagine justice with the concept that the best interest of the part is always served by the best interest of the whole, then we can see like how far we have moved from maybe another idea that might have been a norm. And I totally agree with Amitabh that we can see this rise of demagoguery along with a rise of inequality, and there are norms being disrupted there. But I think we also need to pay attention to a norm that we have accepted, which is a real affront to the justice of the best interest of the part is always served by the best interest of the whole. And I think the only way those visual images, the only way it was possible for millions of people to start walking home is that the people who made those decisions didn't recognize them as fellow human beings. Nobody would have let their mother do that. Nobody would have let their second cousin do that. So our present moment reveals to us that we have really lost a connection to an understanding of what justice really means.
Any comments, Amitabh Bihar? Do you want to say any before we go to the next?
Sure. I mean, you know, the way I understood your example of the Boeing, I completely agree with it. You know, in essence, and that's what Holly is also saying, that completely avoidable deaths are happening, but the society is not paying attention. You know, so that is the problem. That because it's not happening to you or that particular influential, powerful class, then it's all right. As in what happens with malnutrition in this country or what happens with TB does not become important. But precisely because of the reasons Professor Kundu said, COVID is important because it's hitting people across classes. So absolutely, I think that is a critical point. And thank you, Oli, for, you know, ultimately, I do believe that again in our constitution, or just, you know, even going back to the core modern values, we did falter, as in we are faltering now on liberty, equality, but solidarity was something which was so central to that framing, but we have never invested. And that's been one of the critical problems of how we have organized our modern society. That solidarity became pretty much a footnote in the context. So it is critical for us to understand and that factor that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitabh. We move on to our next speaker on our panel, Professor Parag Vaknis, who is an associate professor at the School of Liberal Studies at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University in New Delhi. Professor Parag, please go ahead. And sorry, I would urge the participants to continue to send their questions, and the speakers to please respond in writing if there are questions directed to you.
Okay. Thank you, Arash. Let me just quickly share my screen so that. Is it visible? Yeah? Okay. All right. So I guess those are the two questions that I have gotten so used to. Is it visible? And am I audible, right? Teaching every week online, saying the same things. All right. So thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this very eminent panel. I know I probably might be the most inexperienced in terms of academics, social life, certainly much less experienced in actually participating in civil society as Amitabh is. But I will try to give my my 2 cents and see where we can go with this. I think a lot of it, I may have to warn, is going to be kind of summary of what all the panelists have said before. And my presentation will touch almost all the aspects. It will speak more to what Holly has said, because I start my, I mean, whenever I start thinking about why I came to economics as a study, it was because when I was in college, in 92, this was a time when India was liberalizing, and I was in a college in Pune, and we had this group of people who were also saying that all these reforms are really stopping short of saying that they're bullshit, and basically we should go to the Swadeshi model of thinking, and then everything is going to be all right, right? And a part of me used to think is that, I mean, there has to be something more than this. I mean, it cannot be that simple. And therefore and luckily I had good teachers for economics. So in spite of being a commerce student, I ended up being an economics major, and then I decided to pursue economics. And so when I started teaching economic growth as a topic, it certainly brought everything together, these connections. And I think these connections that have come forward from the past 2 decades, especially, of research on economic growth, kind of gives us a nice framework to think about rebooting ourselves, how we are going to do that, to think about the millions and gazillions of choices that Holly talked about before that we have made, and can we maybe make different choices this time so that we change the way we organize the economy and society in such a way that a dignified life is possible for everyone. And so I think the research, thankfully, economists have kind of pushed this area a little bit more, and they provide a good framework for us. I'm going to put forward that framework and the way I understand it and the way I think is applicable to India. And maybe you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, or maybe suggest a way of going forward. I guess that's what we are here for. So I think, so coming to the question of economic justice, right? And I think I would like to start at the point where I want to define it. And I define it as it's in the sense of availability of opportunities for economic betterment, irrespective of caste, class, religion, or any other discriminatory marker that is available. And that is how I define economic justice. I mean, if this is present, then I would say that the system is just. If this is not present, then I would say that the system is unjust, and we need to do something about it. And clearly, as all of you have pointed out, Arash in his concept note and other people in their talks, this has been conspicuous by absence in India, and maybe in many countries all over the world. It happened by accident a little bit in the countries which we call developed today, right? But there has not been a conscious, justice has not been a conscious policy choice, and it has not been a policy framework in which we have talked about. And I agree with all of you in the sense that COVID, because it hit everybody, and because there were certain sections of population which structurally were more vulnerable to these kind of shocks. And therefore, as Professor Kundu said, they decided to start walking home, because 12 hours walking home and working for 9 hours in inhuman conditions, I mean, the choice is clear, right? I mean, it's much more in my interest to walk home and have the access to those social insurance mechanisms, which would basically help me tide over this kind of shock, is the most rational thing to do. If I stay where I am, where most likely I have been either booted out of my rented accommodation because nobody wants me there, and I have no social security to fall back on, it makes much more sense for me to just walk back, right? I mean, the visuals in terms of being the most important impact, it reminds me of the visual that I used to see every day when I used to walk to the metro to go to my college. There's a small establishment which supplies filtered water in carts all across Delhi. And most of these filtered carts are basically hauled by migrant workers. And these migrant workers, they basically stay in the same shack, which is a small 10 by 10 room, which basically hosts all the filtering mechanism, all their bottles which need to be filled up, and so on. And these people, they basically have a makeshift kitchen on the road. They basically sit on the road with a gas stove and make their lunch there, breakfast and lunch, which is basically the same set of rotis and aloo sabji that they would make. And they would just wound that up, coil that up and put that aside, because within half an hour, the shop where they're going to, where they have hung their clothes to dry on is going to open and their makeshift house is going to close down. So this is the situation in which they live. There shouldn't be any wonder to think about why they decided to walk home. So I think COVID highlighted the fault lines that had already that were already there in the Indian economy, and I think world over too. It highlighted the absence of institutional structures and policies that were absent that would ensure the provision of economic justice. And of course, everybody's talking about the 23% cut in the GDP that we have. The current recession started in 2016 after the monstrosity of demonetization that was unleashed, and then the hasty implementation of GST after that, without even thinking for a moment as to how the formal informal sector linkages are going to navigate their way through this particular thing. And so the huge impact that demonetization had on the informal sector just worsened after the GST, right? So let's not kid ourselves that these were very good policies meant to bring up everybody out. But I guess so let me get to the point is how to think about all these problems. And I think a lot of researchers have basically worked on this. And currently the most important angle of research in economic growth is to look at the historical factors and how they have shaped institutions today, and therefore how they shape incentives for people to do better in their life today, right? And it is very nicely summarized in this fabulous book by Acemoglu and Robinson, where they talk about why nations fail. And they also have another book which has recently come up where they kind of take them in future. But let me just briefly talk about this. It's like all across countries, we have a huge huge disparities all across the world. There are some countries where citizens are able to enjoy immense gains in their standards of living, despite the economic inequality that we talk about, right? All said and done, if you are a minimum wage worker in United States, let's say if you're working in Walmart, your annual income would be about $26,000, right? You will have access to public schooling. You will have access to however broken health insurance mechanisms that you have in United States, and you will have access to food stamps and all that other stuff. And then compare that with the fact that 80% of the world today lives below $10,000 of income, right? So inequality is important. I mean, that is one of the most important factors that we have. But the way it presents in terms of affecting the standards of living and the daily experience of living for people in, let's say, United States or other developed countries versus people in India, which is, I think, still a better example. There are far more worse countries to live in compared to India, is way different. And we have to consider this interaction and how inequality represents in our day-to-day living, depending upon where we are, right? And the research basically says that most of these disparities can be brought down to the role of institutions as fundamental determinant of economic outcomes in countries. And whatever is true for inter-country differences is also true for intra-country differences in prosperity. And these differences come down to the way societies have organized themselves, and they have shaped the incentives of individuals and businesses, so-called economic rules of game, which is a result of the choices that we have made. And many times the choices that we have taken as given as a product of history or product of the political forces that have shaped our standards of living for the past 200 years, right? Economic prosperity is basically just 200 years. One of the graphs which Holly was mentioning, Angus Madison, there is also this another graph which Madison shows about standards of living from one century AD to the current standards of living. And one thing that is clear that we can see is that prosperity, whatever we are talking about, is only the phenomena of recent 200 years, right? We can see that there is some kind of divergence that started happening from 1498 onwards, the year in which Vasco da Gama landed on India, put his foot down on India. But much of the differences in standards of living, the real divergence in terms of the developing countries and developed countries has happened in the past 200 years, right? And there has been a lot of theories in terms of about, let's probably colonialism and the core periphery theory and all this explains it. But if we look clearly in terms of how colonies organize themselves, and not all colonies had the same kind of experience. United States was a colony, Canada was a colony. So, well, Canada is still a dominion of the United Kingdom. Australia and New Zealand were colonies. They seem to have performed very differently than colonies that were, for example, in other countries in Latin America and countries in South Asia, right? So it is not just the answer in colonialism that is important. It is the way colonialism functioned in these different countries. That's where the answer lies. And that's where our institutions come into picture. And I think, so I'm not going to go into all this detail. It's, if you Google Acemoglu and James Robinson talk about this, so I'm not going to take time on that. But let just briefly, they classify institutions as inclusive and extractive. And you can basically map the economic performances of countries today to these nature of institutions. All the countries which have or which are doing well today, right, despite COVID and financial crisis and everything that we have today, their institutions can be classified as inclusive institutions. And all the countries that are doing badly today, their institutions can be classified as extractive institutions. So extractive institutions are defined in a way where the resources are transferred from the bottom to the elite, okay? And inclusive institutions are classified as institutions which in some sense at least ensure that everybody has not an equal, but at least some shot of doing better in life, right? So for example, most of the countries, the developed countries in the world, for about 200 years now, have had free public education for everybody. About 70 to 80% of engineers and scientists that are educated in United States are educated in public schools. They're not educated in private schools. And this human capital differences clearly show up, and they clearly correlate with how countries are doing well today. For example, countries which are developed have on an average 13 years of schooling compared to countries which do not do well. For example, India has about 5 to 6 years of schooling. And that too, as Professor Kundu pointed out, there is huge amount of inequality in terms of access that we have. So 6 years of schooling. And Amartya Sen put it rightly when he said that India is dreaming to be a superpower when its human capital barely has or barely knows how to read and write. And even with that 5 or 6 years of schooling, we know that our human capital is of lower quality because people do not read at the level where they're educated, right? So there is also the quality issues that we have. So clearly, the institutions that are shaping our behavior are a problem. And that's where our choice needs to come in. Our choices needs to come in in order to question every policy that we make and see if that is inclusive or not. Is that going to allow the last person in the income distribution to have a better shot at life or not? If
Parag,
that
if you
doesn't
can
happen,
just conclude in a minute.
yeah, sure. So extractive institutions do the opposite. And I think in India, the extractive institutions basically come into forth on all these categories. So our society is divided in terms of caste. Our economic outcomes correlate very strongly in terms of caste. All the people who are middle and above in the income distribution belong to upper castes in the society. There is ample amount of research. You can read research by Ashwini Deshpande. You can read research by many other people. You can see that caste is a singular marker of doing well in the society. In this thing, we are dividing society today on the basis of religion, which cannot be good for economic progress. Then we have gender. We have distinction in terms of discrimination in terms of location, rural versus urban, east versus west, north versus south. The nature of institutions change. And then we have discrimination based on disability, sexual preferences, and so on. And all these are factors which are not under my control. The caste disadvantage, the reason why the British did not have to do much when they came in India, because there was an unequal system, an extractive system already in place. They just inserted themselves in that system and made it worse. Okay, so the caste system that we have was a tool which the British already had. They had to create those systems in other countries of extractive institutions. They didn't have to do that in India, right? And therefore, when independence happened, the system just remained same. The elites changed, right? The elites, the upper caste just filled up all the seats that we had, which the British elites had left behind. And so the structure did not really change in that sense. So these disadvantages, which are not under my control, they reduce the incentives for investments in human capital by reducing the returns for them. And most of these people do not have access to these kind of investments. So that is the investment that the governments have to do. And this will happen only if redistribution is important, but that redistribution is not of income. That redistribution is of endowment. Okay, and endowment is basically all the advantages that have been conferred over us because we belong to a certain class, because we belong to a certain caste, right? Those endowments need to be redistributed. I believe that markets are not bad in themselves. Okay, it is, as Polanyi points out, when the economic systems get embedded in the social systems, which are to start with unequal, then that basically leads to unequal distribution. And in case of India, perfectly crony capitalism that we have, right? So human capital investments is a public good. Government has to do it. That is very, very important. Primary healthcare is a public good. Legal infrastructure is a public good. Whether I have access to legal mechanisms or not depends a lot on what class I come from. Affirmative action has to say, reservations have to say, because persistence in economic inequities, right, on account of social and cultural capital that is required to generate and sustain a virtual cycle cannot be built in one generation. That takes generations to build, right? So there are short-term policies and there are long-term policies that we will have to take care. Just give me 1 minute and I'll finish. So COVID brought out all these vulnerabilities that we had, but it just highlighted actually these vulnerabilities were already there, right? So we have to address all these. These are all short-term remedies that will basically take care of the vulnerabilities that come out of the structure of the society and the economy. But ultimately, it is the redistribution of endowments that is going to set the stage to come out of the rut that we are and ensure economic justice that we have. So we have to basically question every policy. Is it going to be public inclusive, or is it going to be extractive? And what are we trying to remedy with it? Is it going to address the vulnerability or not? And all this cannot be done without expanding the state capacity. We have limited state capacity, and all that we end up doing many a times is do tokenism, right? And that basically worsens the problem that we have. We have the least number of police per capita in the income category that we belong to, and most of these police are basically catering to politicians. They do not have time to actually take care of ensuring justice and so on. We have the least number of courts per capita in India, and that needs to go up, right? And there needs to be education and recognition that historical factors are responsible in perpetuating economic injustice today, and that cannot be overlooked while we make policy. So let me stop there, and then we can talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. This was a very detailed treatment of the topic with a lot of useful insights. I mean, I was particularly taken in by the insight that you shared, which talks about how economic inequality somehow is embedded within social inequalities. And it becomes so much more important to look at underlying social exploitation patterns of social structures. I mean, so many of these migrants, when one looks at who they were, such a large percentage were Adivasis and Dalits. And so one sees this interlocking of the social and the economic, which makes it so much harder to change just the economic aspect. So I'd like to ask the panelists to please respond to questions from the participants in the Q&A box. You have the option. I'm going to now play the recording of the presentation of Professor Swaminathan. This will be our last presentation.
Good morning. My talk today will be on the pandemic in the light of the country's economic and social realities. First, let me thank Professor Fazli and Devi Ahilya University for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Let me now begin with an assessment of India's COVID-19 experience and how it has been managed. I believe it would be fair to suggest that India's response to the pandemic has been largely inspired by an epidemiological view of the problem. In this approach, the dominant emphasis is on aspects of physical distancing and allied measures aimed at bringing down the reproductive rate of the pathogen as swiftly as possible. This largely is the motivating concern underlying the notion of a comprehensive and generalized lockdown. And this indeed is the measure that has been most vigorously pursued by the state in combating the coronavirus epidemic in our country. What can one say of the effectiveness of a predominantly lockdown response to the pandemic? There is no means of knowing how many lives, if any, were saved, that is from COVID-19, by the lockdown. Official claims of success are based on India's low case fatality rate, or CFR as it is referred to, compared to other, even economically advanced countries. However, the CFR is a very unreliable indicator of COVID mortality. When allowance is made for the age distribution of cases and deaths, and for the fact that death from infection occurs after a lag, we find that India's performance, both absolutely and relatively, has been a good deal worse than is suggested by the CFR statistic. This is in fact the subject of a recent paper by Minu Philip and 𝐿𝐵𝐻𝐵 of New York University and myself. The paper is called Decoding India's Low COVID-19 Case Fatality Rate. Add to this the costs of the lockdown in terms of livelihoods lost and casualties of life and health from non-COVID causes, and it is hard to evaluate India's lockdown in anything but unfavorable terms. It is important to highlight the probably large and unhappily invisible collateral damage caused by a lockdown without adequate precautions against such damage. Specifically, there is no easy way of tracking deaths due to an overstressed health infrastructure which is incapable of dealing with non-COVID life-threatening diseases such as cancer, heart ailment, and tuberculosis, due to starvation, due to long-term health damage, due to intimate partner violence, and due to excesses in enforcement. It is not that the world has lacked examples of more thoughtful ways of managing the pandemic. Kerala and Vietnam showed the way by resorting to a systematic and rigorous regimen of testing, tracing, tracking, and quarantining in the earliest phase of disease progression. This was not any significantly salient part of central government strategy in our country. Migrants should have been allowed, in fact enabled, to return home before the case growth rate accelerated and before the lockdown was implemented, with, as you will recall, just 4 hours notice. Instead, they were subjected to the worst forms of precipitation into distress, poverty, unemployment, loss of income, hunger, immobilization, and the excesses of enforcement. By the time they were allowed to return home, the situation was ripe for the carriers to spread the infection from the towns to their native villages. Let me be careful to clarify that in earlier work done on the subject by Professor 𝐿𝐵𝐻𝐵 of NYU and myself, we have always been careful to point out that we do not oppose the idea of a lockdown as such. But the sort of lockdown we had in mind is one which is accompanied by a comprehensive system of relief measures to compensate the poor and laboring classes for their travails during the shutdown. One during which the health infrastructure is upgraded, personal protective equipment is made widely available, testing is pursued rigorously and on a vastly increased scale, a genuine and substantial fiscal stimulus is arranged, data on crucial aspects of the disease are placed in the public domain in a spirit of transparency and sharing. Policymakers invite and implement the best advice available from epidemiologists, public health experts, economists, and other professionals. And the center assists, protects, and promotes the interests of its states in a proper spirit of federalism. Regrettably, none of these elements seems to have been a prominent feature of the Indian lockdown. Indeed, there has been no dearth of specific and detailed advice on the sorts of relief measures that needed to accompany the lockdown. For specificity, let me refer to the suggestions at the micro level offered by people like Jean Reyes and Ritika Khera, and at the macroeconomic level by people like Pranab Sen. Much of all of this seems to have fallen on deaf ears. A fiscal stimulus, advertised as amounting to 10% of GDP, turned out to be a damp squib 1% affair when it was shorn of its window dressing. Most economic measures were aimed at easing liquidity constraints when banks were ill-prepared to lend and customers ill-prepared to make productive use of loans. In an environment of severely depressed demand and acute physical constraints on the supply side of the equation. Amazingly, a great deal of advice, even on deploying the public distribution system to ease the phenomenon of hunger, was ignored. All of this has to be seen in the light of the socio-economic realities that preside over India. India is a developing country with a massive informal sector and extremely poorly developed social security mechanisms in place. There has also been an immediate prior history of economic distress in the country. The unfathomable policy of demonetization undertaken in 2016, accompanied by the hasty implementation of a goods and services tax, and the immense loss of lives, livelihoods, incomes, and jobs wrought by a COVID-inspired lockdown, have all conspired to send the Indian economy into a spiraling downturn, with unemployment rates hitting record levels, per capita rural consumption expenditure actually declining, poverty rates increasing over the period 2011-12 to 2016-17, and first quarter GDP for 2020 to 2021 contracting by a massive 24%. According to some epidemiologists and public health experts, the COVID infection has probably peaked at the time of speaking and will decline over the next 6 months to become endemic by March 2021. By that time, 50% of the population may be expected to have been infected and gained immunity. And if a vaccine is discovered by then, 50% of the population would need to be vaccinated after eliminating the already infected 50% through antibody testing. From where will the finances for this be raised? A very useful compilation of the super rich of India is available in the annual Hurun India Rich List, brought out in a report by the finance services conglomerate IIFL. The list specifies all entities with a wealth or net worth of at least rupees 1,000 crore, that is rupees 10 billion. The list for 2019 runs to 953 entities, of which 82 are non-resident NRIs. Making some liberal assumption about the wealth of the NRIs, the aggregate wealth of the remaining richest 871 resident Indians works out to something like rupees 37,076 billion, which is nearly 20% of India's 2018-19 GDP of roughly 187,689 billion. A uniform tax of 5% on the wealth of the 871 richest resident Indians should alone yield up 1% of India's GDP, which is double the amount of India's fiscal stimulus. A flat tax rate of 5% has been suggested only for illustrative purposes. One can instead have a differentiated progressive tax structure, as has been recommended in the context of a proposed COVID wealth tax for the European Union member states by Lande, Saez and Zuckman. The case for a wealth tax in South Africa has also been persuasively advanced by Chatterjee, Getten and Yaka, specifically against the backdrop of the COVID crisis. Indeed, the pandemic signals the urgency of raising resources by means of a wealth tax without compromising the case for its implementation on a regular basis in normal times. After all, as the Harun Rich List for 2020 points out, membership to the club of those with a net worth of at least rupees 10 billion has galloped threefold from 2015 to 2020. Imagine the resources that could be raised if the wealth of the richest 10,000 entities in the country were to be taxed. A wealth tax for India is rationalizable by considerations of both justice and need, and is a way of raising resources without resorting to debt and its monetization. The proposal is offered not in the spirit of desperate measures for desperate times, nor even of reasonable measures for desperate times, but in one of ordinary measures for ordinary times. In this view, a wealth tax in India can and must be implemented. Whether or not it will is not for me to suggest, and it is for you to speculate on. This brings me then to my concluding thought of today's presentation. We are a very poor country that has experienced severe economic reversals in the recent past and is now crippled by a viral pandemic and its management. We are, that is to say, in the midst of a humanitarian crisis, which is in no way redeemed by our recent record of strife engendered by caste and religious differences. This, above all, is a time when people must be prioritized over profit and public spiritedness over publicity. We cannot and must not permit the transformation of human vulnerability into a humanitarian disaster. Thank you very much.
So, thank you for patiently being with us. So, friends, we have overshot our time a little bit. I would like to maybe quickly ask our speakers, Professor Swami Subramanian's presentation basically puts forward this idea of a wealth tax, a progressive wealth tax, similar to what Europe has planned to implement, as a measure that would really provide a big stimulus to the efforts to rehabilitate the economy and especially assist the weaker sections. So the question again, now just looking at what was said earlier, if we go back to what Holly mentioned and what Parag also talked about, which is one needs to look at time frames here. Certain interventions are required, but their fruit will be borne in the longer term. Maybe 50 years, she said, maybe even longer. But we can only get there if we are deliberate and thoughtful in deciding on a certain path. As she said, we choose a path. But then there is also and then of course Amitabh Bihar also mentioned about our obsession with GDP, which somehow has this whole issue with growth, which has also in a sense taken us down a certain path. But now coming to the question of India, a lot of those who justify this emphasis on growth say that India needs to grow economically now. We have millions of people who need employment, and our economy needs to expand. It needs to grow in order to give livelihoods to people. So what would be the short-term view that we could take of balancing the requirements of equity with the compulsions of having to manage an economy and bring livelihood and ensure a decent income to a growing number of people. The fact that agriculture is people are transitioning out of agriculture. Now, one can debate whether it was a good option or not, but the fact is millions of people are finding agriculture as an unviable means to make ends meet. And they become migrants. They come to the city because it gives them income. So I particularly like to ask our economists here, Professor Kundu and maybe Parag, if you all could shed light on this question. How does one balance these two in the short term without compromising the long-term prospects?
So, Arsh, sorry, just before others come in, I really need to leave now. My apologies. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Can I come in, or Professor Kundu? Sorry.
Oh, but what? No. I thought I'll talk one or two things about what Amitabh Bihar was mentioning. But Parag, I think interestingly you brought out this historical context of the inclusive and extractive policies, which is extremely interesting. And you also identified some of the factors which are responsible for the disparity and discrimination in the society. You talked about gender, you talked about religion, caste, location, rural, urban, and the states of your residence. These are the factors. And I must tell you that Amitabh, I don't know whether it's still there, Oxfam India is bringing out a report on Indian inequality. And what Arash read out about my institutional affiliation is slightly dated. I'm also in some advisory capacity of Oxfam India, and I'm advising on this inequality report. And some of the questions and the factors which are responsible for the structural inequality will be analyzed in this report. I just have one question which I'm asking myself and I would like to put to the panel. Now, there is contradictory views. One is that the world is not doing enough. India is not doing enough to tackle the problems of the pandemic because it is not affecting the rich, it is affecting the poor. And if the lives of the rich were at risk, like in an aeroplane situation, there would have been much more effort. Frankly, I'm yet to find any evidence to say that the pandemic has hit the poor much strongly than the rich. In fact, if you take the country-wise data in terms of per capita income, region-level data, ward-wise data, you have really no definite evidence to say that it is the poorer people, despite their several vulnerabilities. If you take some kind of an account for them, control for them, you really don't find that happening. And this fact that people are not doing enough because it is the problem of the poor, I have not yet found any conclusive evidence. On the other hand, there is a view that we are doing too much for the COVID. The concern is too high because, and as a result of that, you are polarizing the world. Only 4 companies, there's a new book which has come up, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and they control our whole lives. There is sharpening of inequality. There is absolutely this big facade about tackling the problem of the pandemic is linked with the elite class interest. And in Europe and United Kingdom, there is huge protest. I'm not very convinced that this class bias of the policies can be proved conclusively. I would certainly like to argue that there is a concern for growth at the moment. And many countries are saying, yes, we are promoting the growth strategies because we want to help the poor and the marginalized sections of the population. If that is the case, if really we believe that we have to relax the lockdowns and go for growth strategies, because it is hitting the poor in terms of starvation, nutrition, access to education, access to health, everything. This digital technology is depriving many poor of the basic amenities being available to them. If that is the case, if we are to relax the measures because we want to promote growth, because it will support of the poorer sections, are we doing the right thing in terms of labor legislation, in terms of the concessions which are being given to the entrepreneurs? Is it really helping to bring social and economic justice? And my quick review gives me a mixed picture, where some of the courts, in fact, there was a question whether there is anything in the labor courts specifically for women. I think Soma asked this question. I have looked at that. It says all the workers, 5 million workers, are going to benefit from that. There will be no distinction between, rural, urban, gender-based discrimination. But again, many of the clauses talk about certain categories. So I'm not very clear that this will lead to general empowerment of the unorganized workers. And I do believe that the power of the trade union is likely to be compromised to a certain extent, but we need to analyze that. And I do believe that as social scientists, as concerned citizens, we have a responsibility in different countries to see that whatever panic measures are being taken in the name of the poor, in the name of helping the vulnerable sections, they are re-examined in the context of the long struggle that the laboring class had, and certainly accepting them as final for the, as a part of new normal would not be fair. The measures which are being taken in the labor market, in the capital market, in the policy domain must be subject to judicial scrutiny, administrative scrutiny, and then only we should be in a position to determine whether this growth promoting strategy is really inclusive and helping the poor and vulnerable workers. Thank you.
Parag,
Can I quickly respond?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think there are a couple of points which I wanted to. So I will come to Professor Kundu's questions and see if I can take a stab at them. But before that, I also wanted to address the trickle-down idea of growth, right? So I think so trickle-down basically doesn't work. What I think is the problem is that in how many generations do you want the people who are poor to actually do better? So on an average, we might think that we want within 1 or 2 generations, people to do better. Then that would basically require immense investments in increasing their capacity and capability, right? So that is one thing, and I think that's the problem that Indian economy has today. Is like upper castes who have had a history of access to education, access to health, and who were in beneficiary positions within the colonial government. All these people have actually done better. Most of the people who have been in abroad, if you go to California and look at the Indians who have been settled, they're primarily upper caste IT engineers that we have, right? So the maximum that Indian economy could grow on the basis of all the people who could accumulate human capital based on the historical advantage that they had, we have exhausted it. If we want to increase, if we want to increase economic benefits after this, if we want to have growth, I'm not considering COVID right now, I'll come to that in a few minutes. I think what is now needed is we have this demographic dividend that is there. And these are largely people mostly who have degrees in names, probably, but they lack severely in terms of skills, because the education system is a problem. So there are a lot of micro issues that need to be fixed. But so a short-term issue for this, right, in terms of policy, could be to think about interventions which can, at this particular point of time, employ these people. So it looks like the gig economy which people talk about, seems to be the biggest employer of these people who we talk about as demographic dividends. So could we do something which promotes as a short-term measure starting gig economy businesses easily, so that these people can be employed gainfully at this particular point, right? So because all the interventions that are going to improve the long-term in the economy, it's going to take a long time. I mean, it's going to be, at least we should have 3 or 4 generations going through the schooling, and then there are other policies which need to be put in place and so on. So for that, we will require at least 40 years, 50 years down the line, if at all we get a consensus on what we should do today on this. But at least right now we could address these short-term problems by creating policies which would help sectors in which these people can be employed. Informal sector is going to stay, because all the factors that leads to the emergence of informal sector, we haven't really taken care of that. So addressing those issues by creating digital record keeping and demonetization is not really helpful. It's like saying that you have diabetes because of a faulty liver, but then we are not going to care about that. We're just going to keep transfusing blood, right? Give you every time blood with the low sugar, but then, hey, my liver is still there and it's going to be problematic anyways, right? So that kind of thing. And the second thing about pandemic affecting rich and poor differently, I do agree with Professor Kundu that there is not a lot of evidence to suggest that. There is some bits and pieces. So one of the things that India lacks as a public good is data, right? And government has actually undermined that rather than actually strengthening it. We have held back unemployment data. We have held back GDP data for a very long time. So nobody really knew what happened after the demonetization policy was implemented, other than, so the only consistent data based on some survey that is available today is from a private organization in India, which is CMI. And that kind of, I mean, I don't know what to say to that. And I don't know, I mean, it's great for policymakers who do not want to be judged on the outcomes of their policies. But as for the future of the economy, having data is inevitable. I mean, that's a precondition. You need to measure, otherwise how would you think about it? And that's one of the problem of getting evidence for this rich versus poor and how they have been affected through pandemic. But there are some papers which have used CMI data, and CMI website actually uploads the working papers that uses their household pyramid survey, which is data. And from a macroeconomic point of view, I think the difference is primarily going to be in terms of ability to smooth consumption. So rich people or salaried people and all that, they have many more tools which they can use to smooth consumption, take loans, save and all that. But those tools will not be available for the people from unorganized sector, informal sector, and therefore you could basically see that as manifestation in terms of rise in indebtedness, which we see right now, and also possibly hunger and rationing of food within families for males who are the main workers rather than females. So all these are the effects which we will not be able to measure unless we have good surveys and longitudinal surveys at this point. I think this is a great time to launch a longitudinal survey. I will stop there.
Thank you, Parag. Holly, any thoughts before we end?
I'd just like to say one thing about Professor Subramanian's observation about tax, and that is money is not the problem. The very wealthiest in India, the very wealthiest in the world, and we could include like a Tobin tax on international transfers to get some more of that money. But it's not a question of money. There's plenty of it. It's a question of, do we recognize that it's not acceptable for millions of people in a society to not be living at the level of subsistence? And there are many, many ways we could think about what are the actions that we take so that no one falls below subsistence. We can ask ourselves, when did we start to think it was okay that anyone fell below subsistence? Because the consequence of industrialization was it should have eliminated want from the world. It gave us the technological capacity to clothe and house and feed everyone without human labor being the barrier. So something like basic income, we need to learn how it works, universal basic income, and then we need to apply it, because we need to throw out the idea that a healthy economy requires some people to fall below subsistence. We may have thought that, we were wrong. We have the mental capacity, we have the moral capacity, and we have the money in our back pockets as a human race to fix it. And I want to say thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. Apologies to you and the participants for going half an hour beyond our scheduled time. Unfortunately, there was so much to unpack in this discussion, but it was truly a very rich and insightful discussion. I hope we will have opportunities to interact once again. I will keep the meeting space open in case you would like to respond to the questions, if, those which have not been fully addressed. So once again, thank you, Holly, thank you, Professor Kundu and Parag, for being with us on your Saturday morning. And thank you to all the participants as well.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure participating in the discussion. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Professor Kundu.